In the spring of 1987, FBI counterintelligence officers hunting Soviet spies through the streets of New York had no idea they were the ones being hunted. For nearly a year, the KGB had been tracking America's most sensitive intelligence personnel using a method so invisible that dozens of agents, diplomats, and officials were completely unaware they were marked. The Soviets had found a way to see without being seen, and what the FBI discovered in a warehouse in the Bronx would reveal just how badly American counterintelligence had been outmaneuvered. Robert Ventura had been monitoring air quality for the EPA in New York City for 6 years, and he knew what normal looked like. On March 12th, he was conducting a routine indoor air quality survey on the 18th floor of the Federal Building at 26 Federal Plaza, responding to employee complaints about stuffiness and headaches, the kind of sick building syndrome issues that had become increasingly common in sealed modern office buildings. As part of the standard protocol, he was checking the HVAC return air filters when he decided to run his handheld radiation detector over the accumulated dust, a quick check he was required to perform after years of monitoring urban environments. The Geiger counter began clicking at a rate that made him stop and check the device. He recalibrated and tested again. The reading was elevated, roughly 3 times higher than typical urban background radiation, and it was concentrated in the dust that had accumulated in the return vent filters. These filters pulled air out of the conference rooms and offices on the floor, capturing whatever particles were floating in the workspace. Whatever was causing these readings had been circulating in the air people were breathing. What troubled Ventura was that the isotopes his detector was picking up shouldn't be present in an office building at all. He collected samples from multiple return vents, sealed them properly, and sent them to the EPA's regional laboratory in Edison, New Jersey. Within 48 hours, the lab confirmed his findings and added troubling detail. The dust contained trace amounts of Cesium-137 and Strontium-90, present in extremely fine particulate form. Dr. Helen Kimura, the EPA's regional director for radiological monitoring, reviewed the lab results on March 16th and immediately recognized this was beyond normal environmental monitoring. The isotopes detected were consistent with materials used in nuclear weapons production, but the extremely low levels and specific particle characteristics didn't match any known pattern of industrial contamination or accidental release. Someone had introduced radioactive material into or around the federal building, but the purpose was unclear. On April 7th, Kimura briefed the EPA's assistant administrator, and the decision was made to contact the FBI. Whatever was happening wasn't an environmental accident. Thomas Bradshaw worked as a consular officer at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. His work involved processing visa applications, coordinating diplomatic visits, and managing administrative details. He was also an enthusiastic amateur photographer, the kind who still shot on film, and took pride in developing his own prints in a makeshift darkroom he'd set up in his apartment bathroom. On April 14, 1987, he arrived at work shortly before 9, attended a staff meeting, had lunch in the mission cafeteria, and spent the afternoon coordinating arrangements for a trade delegation. 3 days later, Bradshaw dropped off 6 rolls of film at his usual photo lab on the Upper East Side, a reputable establishment called Precision Photo that specialized in serving serious photographers who demanded quality work. When he returned to pick up his prints on April 20th, the shop owner, Morris Klein, asked to speak with him privately. Klein had been processing film for 30 years and had seen every kind of mistake a photographer could make. But what had happened to Bradshaw's film was something different. All 6 rolls were ruined, but not in the usual ways. The negatives showed a distinctive pattern of fogging, cloudy patches and streaks that Klein immediately recognized as radiation damage. He'd seen it before in technical literature, in photographs taken near nuclear test sites in the 1950s, and in reading materials about how Kodak had discovered above-ground nuclear testing by tracking mysterious fogging in their film stock. Klein asked Bradshaw whether he'd been near any X-ray machines, medical facilities, or industrial sites that might use radioactive materials. Bradshaw was confused and insisted he hadn't been near anything like that. He worked in an office pushing papers. He left the shop unsettled and spent the rest of the day trying to make sense of what had happened. That evening, he called the State Department's security office and filed a report about the ruined film and the photo lab owner's assessment that it had been damaged by radiation exposure. Assistant Undersecretary Caroline Westfield maintained a schedule that would exhaust most people half her age. At 53, she served as one of the State Department's senior officials responsible for coordinating U.S. diplomatic initiatives with the United Nations, splitting her time between Washington and New York, attending endless meetings and managing a portfolio ranging from arms control negotiations to humanitarian assistance programs. On April 20th, Westfield was in New York for meetings related to upcoming arms control discussions. She began with a breakfast meeting with American diplomats at 8, then was driven to 26 Federal Plaza for a 10 o'clock briefing with FBI counterintelligence officials on Soviet negotiating tactics. The briefing lasted nearly 2 hours, after which she attended a working lunch at the UN mission, followed by 2 more meetings that afternoon, then a late flight back to Washington. The next morning, Westfield was scheduled for a routine physical examination, a usual annual occurrence with her physician. She arrived at 8:15 in the morning and was escorted to an examination room. The physical included blood work, cardiovascular assessment, and a chest X-ray. When the radiology technician prepared to conduct the X-ray, she used a handheld radiation detector to ensure equipment was functioning correctly. As she positioned Westfield, the device registered an unexpected signal. The technician paused, recalibrated, and scanned again. The readings were consistent. Westfield was emitting low-level radiation. The levels weren't dangerous, but they were significantly elevated and indicated external contamination. The technician immediately called for the doctor. Dr. Marcus Webb arrived within minutes and conducted his own assessment. The readings confirmed external contamination present on Westfield. Webb questioned her carefully, whether she has been near any radioactive sources or recently visited any nuclear facilities. Westfield explained her schedule, meetings at the Federal Building and UN mission in New York. Nothing that would explain contamination. Webb's concern deepened. Westfield was showing radioactive contamination from an unknown source. Hospital protocols required documentation and reporting to relevant authorities. Westfield was advised to remove her clothing, which was sealed in protective bags, shower thoroughly using decontamination procedures, and postpone her examination. By 11 a.m., Westfield was on the phone with security officials at the State Department, explaining that she had been exposed to radioactive material, possibly during her trip and a day of meetings in Manhattan. The call from State Department security reached FBI headquarters in Washington on the afternoon of April 21st. By next morning, Special Agent Robert Mallory was on a train to New York with instructions to investigate what was being described as possible radiological contamination affecting diplomatic and federal personnel. Mallory had spent 15 years working counterintelligence cases involving Soviet operations, and he understood immediately that the pattern, 2 incidents involving diplomatic personnel, was too specific to be coincidental. Mallory arrived at the FBI's New York field office at 26 Federal Plaza by mid-afternoon and was briefed by SAC William Decker. Decker had pulled together information on both incidents, and both individuals had visited the Federal Building on the days they were found contaminated. Late that afternoon, Dr. Helen Kimura from the EPA met with Mallory and Decker, bringing detailed reports of monitoring data collected since mid-March. She explained the pattern of elevated readings during business hours, the specific isotopes detected, and the correlation between the federal building and the U.S. mission. The pieces fit together in an alarming way. The EPA had detected low-level radioactive contamination in 2 federal buildings since mid-March. The isotopes, Cesium-137 and Strontium-90, were consistent with nuclear weapons materials, not civilian or medical sources. Mallory asked if this could be a terror attack. Kimura explained that radiation levels were far too low to cause health effects or constitute a weapon. The contamination was real, but not dangerous in the way a dirty bomb would be. Decker, with his counterintelligence background, proposed an alternative. What if the radioactive material wasn't meant to harm anyone, but was being used to track who was coming and going? If you wanted to track individuals without physical surveillance or electronic devices, you could mark them with a substance that was invisible, persistent, and detectable with the right equipment. Radioactive particles in trace amounts would cling to clothing, transfer through contact, and remain detectable for days or weeks. Mallory asked Kimura if such a technique was feasible. She confirmed it was not only feasible, but had been discussed in intelligence communities as a theoretical surveillance method, sometimes called radioactive tagging. However, she was unaware of any documented cases where it had actually been used operationally. The question became, who would have the capability, motivation, and access? The Soviet Union immediately came to mind. Soviet intelligence had a history of unconventional surveillance techniques, clear motivation to track American personnel in New York, and technical expertise to produce and deploy radioactive materials in controlled quantities. The KGB and GRU both maintained significant operations in New York under diplomatic cover from the Soviet mission. Decker authorized immediate investigation with 3 priorities: determine the full scope by surveying additional personnel in affected buildings, identify how the material was being introduced and by whom, and assess whether this was isolated or part of a broader campaign. The investigation entered a new phase on April 27th, when FBI technical specialists began determining exactly how radioactive material was being introduced. The 2 obvious possibilities were direct contamination of personal items or contamination of common spaces like conference rooms where personnel spent time. Special Agent Jennifer Koslow led a team that conducted detailed surveys of conference rooms at the federal building regularly used for Soviet-related meetings. Using sophisticated detection equipment from the Department of Energy, they scanned every surface, door handles, table edges, chair armrests, light switches, anything personnel might touch during meetings. The results were striking. One conference room on the 18th floor showed elevated readings on specific surfaces: the door handle, backs of chairs around the main table, and table edges. The contamination was heaviest on surfaces people would naturally touch when entering, sitting, or leaning forward during discussions. Other conference rooms showed similar patterns, concentrated on high-contact surfaces rather than general dispersal. This narrowed the investigation significantly. The contamination wasn't spread through ventilation, but applied deliberately to specific surfaces in specific rooms where personnel dealing with Soviet matters regularly gathered. Someone had physical access to these spaces and was systematically applying radioactive material to ensure anyone attending meetings would pick up traces on clothing and personal items. The federal building maintained strict security. Access to upper floors required credentials, checkpoints, monitored visitors, and cleaning staff underwent background checks. But those protocols created predictable patterns a sophisticated adversary could exploit. Mallory's team pulled security logs for the 18th floor going back 3 months, focusing on the conference room with highest contamination. They cross-referenced access records with meeting schedules, maintenance logs, and visitor logs, searching for patterns. By early May, the investigation had developed enough to brief senior officials. Mallory traveled to Washington on May 4th to present findings to a restricted audience, including FBI counterintelligence, CIA counterintelligence, State Department intelligence and research, and Defense Intelligence Agency. The briefing was classified at the highest levels and focused on 3 points. Contamination was real and ongoing. The targeting pattern suggested Soviet involvement, and the technique represented a significant capability American intelligence hadn't previously encountered. The intelligence community response was mixed with concern and skepticism. Some found evidence compelling and urged immediate action. Others questioned whether alternative explanations had been ruled out. The debate reflected genuine uncertainty about attribution. Proving a foreign intelligence service was responsible for a covert operation was always challenging. Mallory returned to New York on May 5th, with authorization to continue, but with explicit instructions to develop conclusive evidence of Soviet involvement before any diplomatic or public response could be considered. The standard of proof was high, either physical evidence directly linking contamination to Soviet personnel or technical intelligence demonstrating Soviet capability and intent. Mallory's team pulled security logs and visitor sign-in books from the federal building's main lobby going back 3 months, focusing particularly on weekend entries when building activity was minimal and access to secured floors would be more conspicuous. The sign-in books were standard procedure. Every visitor had to provide their name, organization, reason for visit, and the name of the federal employee they were meeting. Security guards were supposed to verify these details and issue temporary credentials accordingly. The breakthrough came from an FBI analyst named Sarah Chen, who was methodically reviewing the weekend sign-in entries. She noticed a pattern that appeared on multiple Saturdays in March and April, a visitor identifying himself as J. Smith, listing his reason for visit as meeting with S.A. Miller. The entries appeared on March 7th, March 21st, April 4th, and April 18th, all Saturdays, all showing arrival times between 9 and 10 in the morning. Chen cross-referenced S.A. Miller against the FBI's personnel directory and found Special Agent David Miller, who worked in the white-collar crime division and had an office on the 12th floor. When investigators contacted Miller and asked whether he'd had any meetings on those Saturday dates, Miller's response was immediate and emphatic. He hadn't been in the building on any of those Saturdays. In fact, he'd been out of state on 2 of those dates, attending training courses at Quantico. He had no idea how his name could have appeared in the sign-in logs as the host for these visits. This discrepancy transformed the investigation. Someone, presumably Smith, had obtained legitimate visitor credentials using the name of a real FBI agent who had no knowledge of these visits. The credentials had been processed through official channels, which meant either someone inside the federal bureaucracy had been manipulated or deceived, or there was a more serious security breach in the credential issuance system. More importantly, the dates of Smith's visits aligned almost perfectly with the Monday morning spikes in radiation readings that the EPA had been documenting. If Smith had been applying radioactive material to surfaces during these Saturday visits, personnel arriving for work on Monday morning would begin transferring the contamination, creating the pattern that had been detected. Mallory made the decision to set a trap. The EPA data showed that contamination levels typically required refreshing every week to 10 days, which meant if the pattern held, Smith would likely attempt another weekend visit soon. On Saturday, May 9th, the FBI positioned a surveillance team in and around the federal building. The building's normal weekend security staff were briefed on the operation and instructed to process any visitors normally. At 9:43 that morning, a man entered through the main lobby entrance. He presented credentials to the security desk, signed the visitor log using the same format as the previous entries, listing meeting with S.A. Miller as his reason for visit, and was issued temporary access. The security guard, following the rehearsed protocol, processed everything normally and watched as Smith proceeded to the elevator banks. Two FBI agents, dressed as maintenance workers, followed Smith into an elevator. He pressed the button for the 18th floor, exactly where the highest concentrations of contamination had been detected. When the elevator doors opened, Smith stepped out and slowed down his pace to see if anyone followed him off the elevator. The agents remained in place, and the elevator door closed. Smith then walked directly toward the corridor where several sensitive conference rooms were located. Visual contact was maintained by another agent hidden on that floor, although he had limited view of Smith. He watched as Smith entered conference room 1847, but he could not see what was happening in that room. Smith remained in the conference room for approximately 12 minutes. When he finally emerged from the conference room, he walked with the careful deliberation of someone who just completed a task requiring concentration and precision. He returned to the elevator and descended to the lobby. As Smith exited the federal building onto Federal Plaza, the FBI surveillance team moved into action. 4 agents in civilian clothing began following him at varying distances, coordinating their movements through concealed radio communication. The plan was simple: maintain visual contact, document where he went, and identify who he was or where he returned to. But within 2 blocks, it became clear that Smith had detected the surveillance. He stopped abruptly at a newsstand, not to purchase anything, but to use the reflective glass to observe the street behind him. He crossed the street mid-block against traffic, a classic counter-surveillance move designed to force followers to reveal themselves by making the same unusual crossing. He entered a subway station, descended to the platform, then immediately turned and came back up the stairs, watching to see who followed. The FBI team, experienced but working in daylight in a relatively empty weekend downtown, couldn't maintain complete invisibility against a target who clearly knew what to look for. By the time Smith emerged from the Chambers Street subway station, his body language had changed entirely. He moved with purpose and speed, no longer the casual visitor, but someone actively attempting to break contact with surveillance. He began moving through the city with practiced evasion techniques, ducking into buildings with multiple exits, taking taxis for short distances before abandoning them, using the subway system's complexity to create choke points where followers would be exposed. Mallory, monitoring the operation from a command vehicle, made the call. Smith had made them, which meant he would disappear if they didn't act immediately, and any chance of identifying him or understanding the full scope of the operation would be lost. At 11:17, Mallory ordered the team to move in for an arrest. The takedown happened on Canal Street, near the entrance to the Manhattan Bridge. 6 FBI agents converged on Smith simultaneously, surrounding him before he could react. He didn't resist physically, but his face showed no surprise, only the resignation of a professional who understood the situation had shifted beyond his control. He was placed in handcuffs and transported directly to the FBI's field office for interrogation. The man carried no wallet, no identification, no personal items beyond a small leather satchel that contained the application equipment, fine brushes, small sealed containers, and protective gloves. Everything was consistent with what FBI analysts had theorized about how the contamination was being applied, but the man himself remained a cipher. His clothing had no labels, and he carried nothing that would identify his nationality or affiliation. Initial processing revealed nothing useful. His fingerprints were run through FBI databases and came back negative. He spoke perfect English with no discernible accent and gave his name as John Smith, providing a false address in Brooklyn. When interrogators attempted to question him about the radioactive materials and his presence in the federal building, he invoked his right to remain silent and requested a lawyer. He was professional, calm, and entirely uncooperative. It took nearly 18 hours of bureaucratic coordination before the breakthrough came. FBI counterintelligence, working with the State Department's Diplomatic Security Division, cross-referenced the man's physical description with known Soviet intelligence officers operating in New York. On Sunday afternoon, May 10th, an analyst identified him as Yevgeny Boroshin. Intelligence assessments had long suspected Boroshin of being a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover, but this was the first time he'd been caught engaged in hostile intelligence activity on American soil. The identification created immediate complications. As a diplomatic official, Boroshin enjoyed immunity from prosecution under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. The FBI could detain him for questioning, but they couldn't charge him with crimes or hold him indefinitely. The State Department would need to be involved, diplomatic protests would need to be filed, and the ultimate resolution would likely involve Boroshin's expulsion from the United States rather than any kind of criminal trial. But the FBI's immediate concern wasn't legal proceedings against Boroshin. It was understanding the full scope of the operation he'd been running. During the 18 hours of detention before his identification, FBI technical specialists had thoroughly examined the contents of his satchel. The sealed containers held trace amounts of radioactive material, later confirmed to be the same Cesium-137 and Strontium-90 particles that had been detected throughout the federal building. What the FBI didn't find was any indication of where the radioactive material was stored, who else was involved in the operation, or how long it had been running. Boroshin's apartment, which FBI agents searched under emergency authority while he was in custody, revealed nothing of operational value. The apartment was sterile, containing only basic furnishings and personal items consistent with a diplomat living abroad. There were no documents, no communications equipment beyond a standard telephone, no radioactive materials, no evidence that the apartment was being used for anything beyond sleeping and eating. The State Department, briefed on Boroshin's arrest and the evidence of his involvement in the radioactive surveillance operation, moved quickly. On Monday, May 11th, diplomatic notes were delivered to the Soviet mission, formally declaring Boroshin persona non grata and requiring his departure from the United States within 72 hours. The notes cited activities incompatible with diplomatic status, but didn't specify the exact nature of those activities, a standard formulation designed to allow both sides to manage the incident without public escalation. Boroshin was released from FBI custody late Monday afternoon and returned to the Soviet mission, where he would remain until his departure. The FBI maintained surveillance on the mission, documenting who came and went, but there was little operational activity visible from the outside. The Soviets, aware that one of their officers had been caught and that the FBI now understood at least part of what they'd been doing, appeared to be shutting down whatever operational infrastructure they'd built. This left the FBI in a frustrating position. They had caught a KGB officer in the act of contaminating a federal facility. They had physical evidence of the radioactive materials and application equipment, but they had no leads on where the materials were stored, who else was involved, or how extensive the operation had been. Mallory spent Tuesday, May 12th, reviewing every piece of evidence collected during Boroshin's brief detention. The contents of his satchel, the sealed containers of radioactive material, the application tools, everything was being analyzed by FBI technical specialists and Department of Energy experts looking for any clue that might lead to the operation's support infrastructure. The breakthrough came not from the physical evidence, but from financial records. FBI analysts, working with Treasury Department investigators, had been quietly reviewing financial transactions associated with Soviet diplomatic personnel in New York, looking for patterns that might indicate operational activity. On the afternoon of May 12th, an analyst identified a series of cash withdrawals made over the previous 9 months by a Soviet cultural affairs officer named Dmitry Kazakov. The withdrawals, each for amounts just below the threshold that would trigger reporting requirements, totaled nearly $40,000 and had been made at various banks across New York City. Kazakov had no apparent reason to be withdrawing such large amounts of cash. His official duties involved cultural exchange programs and didn't require significant cash expenditures, and the timing of the withdrawals correlated with periods when contamination levels in federal buildings had been refreshed, suggesting new batches of radioactive material had been acquired or processed. The next morning, FBI surveillance teams spotted Kazakov leaving the Soviet mission. He emerged and began what counterintelligence officers immediately recognized as a surveillance detection route, the same kind of careful, methodical movement through the city that trained intelligence officers used when they needed to ensure they weren't being watched. Kazakov spent nearly 2 hours moving through Manhattan, changing subway lines, entering department stores through one entrance and exiting through another, sitting in restaurants and watching the street. The FBI surveillance team, having learned from their experience with Boroshin, maintained extremely loose coverage, relying on multiple rotating teams positioned at strategic choke points rather than attempting close physical surveillance that would be easily detected. After completing his surveillance detection route, Kazakov took a taxi to the Bronx, to an industrial area near Hunts Point. The surveillance team maintained distant observation as Kazakov's taxi stopped at a warehouse facility on Bruckner Boulevard. He entered through a side door and remained inside for approximately 20 minutes. When he emerged, he wasn't carrying anything visible, but his body language suggested tension, the quick movements and frequent glances around that indicated operational stress. The FBI faced a critical decision. They could move immediately to search the warehouse, risking that Kazakov might have already sanitized whatever was inside, or they could maintain surveillance and wait to see if others visited the location. Mallory, coordinating with FBI leadership and the U.S. Attorney's Office, decided to move quickly. Within 2 hours, a federal judge had issued a warrant, and FBI agents, accompanied by DOE specialists in protective equipment, were preparing to enter the facility. The entry was conducted at 8 in the evening on May 13th. The warehouse was a space of approximately 1,500 square feet. What the FBI found inside answered virtually every remaining question about how the Soviet radioactive surveillance operation had worked. The facility had been divided into functional areas. One section contained radiation containment equipment, lead-lined storage cabinets, air filtration systems, protective suits, and dosimeters. Inside the storage cabinets, DOE specialists found multiple sealed containers of finely powdered radioactive material, Cesium-137 and Strontium-90, in particle sizes so fine they resembled talcum powder. The quantities were substantial, far more than what Borishin had been carrying in his satchel, enough to sustain contamination operations for months. Adjacent to the storage area was the application workshop: brushes, sprayers, specialized tools, and testing equipment for measuring contamination levels. There were also portable radiation detectors, suggesting that Soviet surveillance teams had been using these devices to track contaminated American personnel throughout the city. The discovery of the warehouse and its contents on May 13th effectively ended the Soviet operation. FBI agents secured all materials, documented everything with photographs and detailed inventories, and arrested Dmitry Kazakov when he returned to his apartment later that evening. Unlike Borishin, Kazakov's diplomatic status was less clear. He held a lower-level position at the Soviet mission, and legal analysis suggested he might not enjoy full diplomatic immunity. The decision was made to hold him pending further legal review. For the individuals who had been targeted, Thomas Bradshaw, Caroline Westfield, and the 33 others identified through FBI screening, the knowledge that they'd been tracked for months without awareness created lasting unease. Medical evaluations confirmed they'd suffered no physical harm from the radiation exposure. The levels had been far too low to cause any health effects, but the psychological impact of having been marked and monitored by a hostile intelligence service was more difficult to address. The investigation officially concluded in August 1987 with a classified report distributed to senior policymakers and congressional intelligence committees. The report documented the operation's scope, assessed the damage to American intelligence activities, and recommended changes to security protocols and radiation monitoring procedures. The specific details remain classified to this day. Robert Ventura, the EPA technician whose routine air quality check on March 12th had initiated the investigation, never learned the full story during his career. He'd filed his report on unusual radiation readings, provided samples to the laboratory, and answered questions from investigators, but the classified nature of what he'd discovered meant the complete context remained hidden. The technique that had seemed so sophisticated and invisible proved vulnerable once detected, but for 9 months it had provided the KGB with intelligence about American personnel and operations that would have been extraordinarily difficult to obtain through any other means. The fact that it was ultimately discovered and dismantled didn't erase the reality of what it had accomplished during the time it remained operational, and that reality served as a reminder that vigilance, thorough investigation, and willingness to consider unconventional possibilities remained essential in the ongoing challenge of protecting national security.